Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Claudia Williamson. Hello, Claudia. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
I'm great, Claudia. Claudia, where are you teaching today?
I am teaching at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga.
Okay, and where were you before relocating to this present university?
So I came to UTC in 2020, and before that, I had been teaching at Mississippi State University for 9 years.
Oh, for 9 years.
Yes, that's
Wow.
right.
I'm looking at your photo and you look really young.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. So, Claudia, some years ago, you wrote a paper titled The Civilizing Society. This is the title of the paper, Claudia,
Mhm.
and you actually won an award. I read all of it and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Claudia, in your paper, you are making the case for virtues. Your argument is that virtues cultivate a free and prosperous society. What are some of these virtues?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, especially for economists to start grappling with. So, when we think about virtues, we typically think about philosophers or maybe sociologists having this conversation. But more recently, economists have started diving into the importance of virtues, especially for market activity. So, when we talk about virtues, usually in economics, we try to talk about values or beliefs or norms that are going to directly relate to production, exchange, or participation in markets, for example. So, one of the most researched topic in this space would be looking at the importance and role of trust and trustworthiness. So, when we think about a virtue that you as an individual would be someone that other individuals think is trustworthy, that has huge economic consequences. So, for example, it may be the case that if you own a business and people view you as trustworthy, that other businesses are willing to transact with you without a formal written contract. And in economics, we would say that that reduces transactions cost. So, anytime we get so for some reason that there's a reduction in cost, we're going to get more of that activity. So, trust as a virtue can facilitate market exchange and market production at a lower cost. And so that's why we see the correlation between higher trust and economic growth. Some of the
Yeah,
other, okay, go ahead.
no, I was just about to say yes, trust reduces transaction costs.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so trust reduces transactions cost. And then one of the other ways that it can promote market participation is through reducing what we call monitoring cost. And
What
so when we
cost?
think
Oh,
monitoring,
monitoring cost. Okay.
yes. So we can think about this too in the employer-employee relationship where, employers have to take at times costly steps to make sure their employees are doing what they're supposed to be doing. But in a situation where there's more trust between individuals, employee and employers in this example, then they don't have to invest in costly monitoring mechanisms. And so again, you have resources that are freed up to be utilized in more productive ways.
Exactly. And Claudia, let me read the definition produced by, how do you pronounce his name? Is it Klein or Klein?
Klein.
Oh, Klein, yes, I got it correctly. Klein 2000 defines trust as a confidence that an individual who makes an agreement will follow through with the terms of the promise. So do you know what this means, Claudia? And Deidre McCloskey, in her book on bourgeois virtues, she marshals several studies to confirm this point. When people trust each other, Claudia, they're willing to form multi-million dollar contract. Sorry, they're willing to engage in multi-million dollar business deals without forming a written contract.
Right, that's exactly right. So that would overall, I would say that we're trying to not only understand that, but to figure out how to facilitate situations in which, in the lowest cost ways, we can have multi-million dollar business contracts or exchanges that are taking place that don't require tremendous oversight. So another example of that would be looking at international trade. And so it's, trade between countries, there's no real third party enforcer. So there's no, extra government layer that's going to really monitor trade that takes place between countries. So most of that's happening in a space where we have to rely on trust.
Exactly. And I've read the data on the relationship between international trade and trust.
Yes.
Claudia, let me read a snippet from your piece. Individuals living in higher trust societies spend less time diverting resources to protect themselves to avoid being exploited and more time engaging in productive activities. Can you imagine, Claudia, when we trust each other, the cost of security is reduced?
Yes, that's exactly right. And we see this in our daily lives here. So even though in the United States, we live in a relatively secure country compared to other places, we also still divert resources into protection against theft, for example. So locking our doors or purchasing a lock to be able to lock our doors is an example of that. And so anytime that you're in a situation in which you have to scale that up, so you have to divert more and more resources for protection of your property, including yourself, then that's going to be an opportunity cost associated with those dollars that could have been going into more productive uses.
Exactly, Claudia. Remember, informal norms are important, but we don't pay for them. So in the absence of high trust, we have to rely on formal mechanisms, and they're expensive. So for example, the government bureaucracy has a staff and the staff members need to be paid.
Correct. So when we think about, well, if you don't live in a trusting society, if you live in a situation in which individuals distrust each other, what are the ways in which they can be facilitated to transact? And so one alternative is then the government has to provide this as a third party kind of enforcer of rules or creation of rules and enforcer of those rules. The other thing that I would suggest within that is that there are informal ways that aren't necessarily cultural. And so in the research that's looking at the importance of anarchy in development, for example, we do have cases throughout history where individuals did not trust each other. So different ethnic groups, for example, figured out how to trade with one another. And they did so in very creative ways. For example, they would adopt a costly signal, such as learning the other group's language or learning their customs and providing gifts that would signal, I understand you, I might not trust you, but I want to trade with you. And I'm going to show you that I'm not here to cheat you by adopting your language or your customs. And they would even go as far as to offering up individuals within their own ethnic group or tribe to intermarry, to establish these bonds that don't exist because from the get-go, they don't actually trust each other. And so I would argue that that's an example of informal ways that we can still engage in productive exchange that's not relying on trust and that's not actually relying on the government as well.
Okay, Claudia, but the downside of that example is that in such societies, it is more complicated to create true markets that require impartial trust and cooperation over a longer distance. So for example, many contend that impartial norms conferred an advantage on Western Europeans, whereas in China and India and other places, markets were productive, but the scale of trust was lower.
Yeah, so it would absolutely be a scalability concern in the example that I gave. And so when we're trying to understand, well, what is the kind of optimal way, if you want to think of it in those terms, to facilitate production, productive economic exchange, financial development, economic growth, then yes, ideally you have individuals who are operating in a high trust society and then also have, better formal rules or government that isn't corrupt, for example.
Yes, Claudia, and low trust societies, they're usually low in social capital and they're poor and corrupt. Low trust
Correct.
societies cannot benefit from wide scale networks because these networks require impartial norms. So for example, social trust is low in the Caribbean, and I live in the Caribbean. And
Okay.
recently, Claudia, a lady, she wanted information, but she didn't need to call me because she could have Googled it online. The company, well, not company, the organization, Claudia, has a website, a list of membership, and even an incorporation address. But Jamaica is a low trust society. Is a low trust society, so people, for whatever reason, are always skeptical of strangers, even when they don't have a reason to do so. So this
Hmm.
lady, she called me to verify something that did not require verification, because the media reported on the organization, and the organization has an actual website and an email. So she had no reason to call me, but it is a low trust society. Yes, I was annoyed, Claudia.
Well, that is a really good example because it seems very simple and basic, but when you would scale that up to the number of times that people are doing those sorts of verifications, it is quite costly.
Yeah, it's just like even the interview. So I sent you an email and you said yes. If you are busy, you would have said I am busy. If you were unable to meet to show up, you would have said Lipton, I am unable. But
Hmm.
in Jamaica, a low trust society, people are skeptical for no reason. So I communicate with foreigners all the time, Claudia, and the
Okay.
correspondent is usually quite enjoyable. Foreigners don't ask me questions like, why are you sending the email?
Okay.
Yes, but Jamaica is a low trust society. So in such societies, people are less likely to innovate because they don't trust people. They assume that every other person is a criminal.
Or they're trying to get information from them that they shouldn't be trying to get for some reason. So I do understand that, but it is I think that's a very good example of just how living in a low trust society affects day-to-day life and your day-to-day outlook from other people. So it's not just about do I buy this product or not, or enter into a contract or buy a house. It's more of how do I engage with other people. And so that was one of the points that I tried to make in the paper you mentioned, and then several other papers that have followed since, where it's really your kind of broad outlook on life in terms of your cultural beliefs and your norms and your values that structure all of your behavior, not just economic behavior.
Yes, and this has implications for innovation. And why am I talking about innovation? So America is an innovative society, and individualism and intellectual autonomy both predict human capital formation and individual and innovation. So I'm from a society that's closer on the collectivism side of the
Mm-hmm.
spectrum, and it's also a poor society. So because it's not a rich society, I developed an interest in culture, trust, and David Landis. He's actually the pioneer. David Landis has motivated my articles and even this show, because he said in the long term, culture makes all the difference.
Yes,
And I have
yes.
so many anecdotal examples. This is a factual example. It's not an anecdotal one. So, for example, during the Industrial Revolution in England, people were willing to share ideas with each other. The English
Mm-hmm.
were less selfish when compared to other European groups. The Industrial Revolution occurred in England. England became quite innovative, and they were able to spread these ideas to America and places in Europe. In a low trust society, Claudia, how do you innovate? Innovation is a collaborative process, but in a low trust society, you don't collaborate. So how do you innovate?
I think that's a really great question. What we have seen theoretically and empirically in the work that you were mentioning by Landis, and then also Joel Mokyr has fantastic work with the same type of historical examples where across all education levels during the Industrial Revolution, you get individuals coming together, sharing ideas, they're tinkering with machinery, they're trying to figure out and understand how things work, and they innovate through a very collaborative process, even though those societies we would still classify as individualistic. And so I think that it's important to not only consider the role of trust, but also kind of more of a core type belief. And so individualist societies are more innovative and entrepreneurial. And so why we kind of hypothesize that that's the case is they value not just progress, but creativity. They value creativity. They value independent thought. So from that, we, kind of translate into that as explaining why we see innovation correlated with individualism instead of collectivist societies. And so in low trust societies, it is very difficult to get that type of valuation. Not only do you not trust other people, but perhaps you're also in a situation in which you don't understand or see any return to valuing creative thought or questioning authority or questioning the way that things have always been done, going against tradition. And so we see those things typically correlate and align with one another.
Yes, Claudia, and individualism also affects the diffusion of technology, in particularly ICT.
Yeah, so in individualistic countries, individuals tend to then be more willing to adapt to the latest technologies more quickly, whether it be a sense of wanting to be at top of their game or on the cutting edge of technology, or if it's more of, other reasons such as that cultural bias of being more accepting of new things. Yes. So I think that's a very kind of important overlap in trying to understand how these different cultural values do tend to correlate and work together.
And Claudia, maybe you are also familiar with this literature, but there is a growing literature asserting that individualistic societies are also more likely to protect property rights and the commons, and they're also less corrupt.
Correct, yes. So what we find is that individualistic societies compared to collectivist ones tend to have better property rights in terms of defining and then enforcement of those rights, whether it would be land or capital and machinery, or even intellectual property rights and labor rights as well. We also tend to find, which is somewhat, I think at first glance, potentially at odds with that statement, we tend to find that individualistic societies are also less regulated. So there are fewer formal rules for individuals to operate and own a business, for example, in individualistic countries, but yet they have better and more secure property rights and contract enforcement.
Claudia, you have a paper on this topic which somebody called Lewis Davis.
Yes, with Lewis Davis. Yes, I do. Yes.
Yes, individualistic countries, they're more skeptical of regulations, culture and what is the title of the paper again? Culture and
the regulation of entry.
Yes.
And I've actually had several additional follow-up papers looking at individualism related to other business regulations, including insider trading regulation, property rights and contract enforcement. And then we have another paper with Lewis that's getting at more of this understanding of how individualism, which in some sense we can consider those capitalistic values, but how individualistic countries tend to support women's rights better. And so we've extended it to not only looking at kind of if you want to think of it as the kind of core foundational institutional environment that's necessary for a market economy, but to also look at different social aspects. And we tend to see that if you're in an individualistic society, women do better in terms of how other men view them, the value system in that country, but then also the ability to work outside the home, and higher labor force participation rates, and more protection from the law to be treated equally.
I also like the research of Lewis. I plan to have him at some point.
Oh, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I actually spoke. He's yet to respond, but I sent him a mail.
Okay, I will make sure that he understands that you're someone to be trusted.
Yeah, exactly.
He should do it. Yes.
And Claudia, I more than likely, since you're an economist, you have more information on this topic, but there's also a fascinating literature detailing the link between family and individualism and innovation more broadly.
Yeah, so The literature that I'm more familiar with is relating it to this concept of what we call family ties. And so
Yes.
Alicina, yes, and a set of different co-authors really kind of brought this more into the economics literature of understanding the role of the family in economic production and economic outcomes. And what they showed is that the stronger family ties, you tend to see more negative economic consequences. And so they had a variety of arguments. And what Lewis and I then built off of was incorporating the role of culture. And what we show is that if you're more collectivist, you then tend to have stronger family ties that then have adverse economic consequences. So more individualistic countries have looser family ties. And, the idea there is that family is more supportive if you want to break family tradition and start a different business, or you be different, or, not be as obedient, be more creative, independent thought, and, individual praise for that innovation and entrepreneurial spirit.
All right, Claudia, I like what you're saying. Culture can actually be a regulatory barrier then.
Absolutely. It absolutely can. So this is where, if we go back to Deirdre McCloskey's work, she does a great job of highlighting this by saying, if you don't praise entrepreneurs, for example, what she calls sweet talk, and that can disincentivize someone to be entrepreneurial. And so part of her explanation for why the Industrial Revolution happened, when it happened and where it happened, is that individuals started understanding the benefit of being entrepreneurial, and they actually started speaking that. They started praising individuals for being innovative, for breaking away from the way things had always been done, for discovering new ideas and having those conversations. And people that were visible and successful were then being praised from their community, from their peers, from their family members. And that's what she really argues was that spark that really set off the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, Deirdre McCloskey and Joel Moncur are the leading writers on the great divergence of our era.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they are fantastic.
Yes, I love Joel Moncur and Deirdre. I may have Deirdre soon. I'm still working on Joel Moncur. I hear that he's hard to get from some of his colleagues.
I think he's busy right now, yes.
Well, Joel Moncur is always busy. He's really
That's
productive.
true. That is true. Always in demand.
Yeah, but his knowledge base is just so wide. Like, he can tell you about the proto-enlightenment movement in China. He can write on science in India. His knowledge base is just unusually wide.
That is true. That is so impressive.
Yeah, just like Deirdre, she's a theologian, a philosopher, yes, a mathematician. What is she unable to do?
Exactly.
Yeah, but back to the issue of culture and bureaucracy. So if you live in a low trust and collectivistic society, more than likely it will be corrupt, and you're going to demand regulations and bureaucracy. But look at the flip side, Claudia. Bureaucrats tend to be ineffective, so regulations can create further distrust.
Yeah, so it can end up setting off a kind of a vicious circle, if you want to think of it that way, because you get more regulation, but then the regulation tends to be written in ways that's not going to enhance economic exchange. It's not written for the benefit of the public at large. It's probably written for the benefit of the bureaucrats and politicians, which then can lead to further distrust. And so that's where it becomes hard to provide any real hard policy implications. Overall, I would say we would argue that by opening up and allowing markets, however that needs to happen, whatever's preventing, if there's a heavy-handed regulation. So if you have a lot of regulation to open a business, let's get rid of those regulations. Let's try to figure out ways to open up markets, more market participation. Individuals will start figuring out who they can trust and who they can't trust. And then that's going to start leading to innovation in those specific areas to figure out how to transact so it's more of pushing aside the formal bureaucrats and letting markets in, and through market participation, you'll start to see some of those kind of virtuous cultural norms rise as well.
Exactly. Claudio, the Cato Institute, his name is Alex Noraste. Maybe you have
Mhm.
read him on a couple occasions. His
Yes.
research is usually interesting but counterintuitive. Alex and his co-author, they have a paper claiming to debunk the nexus between trust and economic growth. Are you familiar with that paper?
I am vaguely familiar, but I don't exactly remember what their main argument
Yeah,
is.
I don't remember their main
Okay.
arguments either, but I do remember surveying the paper and I just said that I'll have to look at it again because so far it's the only paper I have seen that has been so critical of the literature on trust.
So without looking at it, one, the not specific to Alex's work, but some criticisms that I have seen fall more on the empirical side. And so what I was just describing as if you get more market participation, you'll see a rise in trust levels. What that is introducing theoretically, and then is going to be hard to deal with empirically, is this idea of reverse causality. And so cultural norms and formal markets and formal rules definitely are bidirectional. And so what I mean by that is, individualism and trust can underpin and support market activity, but the more market activity that you have can also increase levels of trust and value individualistic cultural norms. And so empirically that can get very tricky to sort out, but theoretically the argument is there. And so this is why it's so important anytime that you're doing empirical work or reading empirical work, you first got to understand, well, what are the theoretical arguments as to why this association should be there? What does it make sense? And all of the ideas that we've been discussing are more from that space, that there is a theoretical reason why trust would increase economic growth by reducing transactions and monitoring costs, for example. I would imagine that a lot of the criticisms from Alex are more on the empirical side, that the way that it's been either measured from survey data or the way that it's been tested with the econometric techniques that we have are perhaps not ideal. And I would agree they're not ideal, but because it's relying on a very strong theoretical conceptual argument, then when you have data to support that, to me, that does make sense. And it is a comprehensive illustration that this argument that trust leads to economic growth is sound.
Yes, and countries that are low in trust are usually not rich. So I was doing some research on East Asia at one point, and some writers argue that social capital in East Asia was higher, and in a sense, this affected long-term growth rates. Whereas in Africa, the literature on trust is a bit sketchy, but the consensus is that Africa is a low trust region.
Yeah, so the East Asian countries are interesting in how they tend to kind of pop up on cultural values and trust. And I think that this is where it gets interesting to distinguish between different types of trust. And so you can have what we would consider generalized or more anonymous trust, which is really what would be important for market transactions and market activity. That I may trust people I know or my neighbor or my family, but then I don't trust anybody outside of that relatively small network. And I think that's what they tend to find more in the East Asian countries compared to African countries where maybe they trust no one. And so both countries probably suffer from, or both regions probably suffer from the idea of anonymous or generalized trust, at least enough to be scaled up where you would see it really have a strong impact on economic markets.
Exactly. And East Asia had a history of tribalism and clans, but clans are more persistent in Africa today.
Yes, absolutely. And so they're relying on their small network. So any transactions that do take place is at that level. And that goes back to our conversation a little bit ago when we were saying that's just something that you can't scale up.
So for example, Claudia, I read the data on African literature and I also love the Nollywood movies, and movies reflect contemporary life. And today in Africa, councils are still important, and councils can either promote innovation or block it. but people still take the advice of village elders seriously.
And that's not necessarily bad in the sense that it is providing a function. And so, again, if you look historically and contemporarily, that is providing a role of governance, which is needed, especially when there's issues dealing with collective action. So, but you're right that it can get stunted or it's not facilitating innovation and entrepreneurship and economic growth, but it can also at the same time make sense as to why they do still rely on tribal council.
Village elders, Claudia, can reduce tension, so they're good for promoting good governance. But when we begin to talk about ICT and privatizing properties, maybe they're going to become a problem.
That's true. That's a great question to ask and to try to understand.
Yeah, so the elders, they provide insight, but many of these people are traditional and we're living in the 21st century. So their insights in relation to economics may not be that useful.
Yes, I would say that that's something that probably needs additional research and maybe even more local on the ground case study type research.
Yeah, but Claudia, I was speaking to Jeffrey Williamson, who is now retired but still very sharp. So Jeffrey Williamson has some health challenges and a problem with his sight. Claudia, I told him to comment on articles he published like 5 years ago, and I doubt that the articles were in front of him, but his memory was excellent. In his 80s.
That's impressive. Yes, it's extremely impressive.
Jeffrey Williams could talk about the articles without looking at them. He wasn't stuttering. He was just very coherent. I was the one who was forced to ask proper questions because he's just so smart. Yes. When you reach Jeffrey's age, you want to be like him. Absolutely.
I had similar experience with Israel Kirzner.
Oh, Israel. Is he still doing academic work?
I think he's very much slowed down, but he would, when I was doing my postdoc at NYU, he would usually come to 1 or 2 seminars a year. And he was still at that time presenting. I saw him present at a Hayek lecture at George Mason University. I saw him present at FEE when they were still doing their graduate PhD student seminars. And he was so just spot on, never missed a beat, just amazing. And I was like, that's what I aspire to be, not only now, but at that age, to be that sharp would be.
Yeah, that would be awesome. It's just like Walter Block. Walter Block wrote excellent columns until one day he literally just died.
Yes, it's just very difficult to imagine, how they're able to be that sharp.
Yeah, like Walter Block was always on the ball, and like when he died, I was like, people like him actually die. Yeah, if he were alive, if Walter had been alive, he would have been a guest. But back then I didn't have the show.
Yes.
Yeah, but unfortunately, great minds die, so we just keep the ground running.
I've also always thought that one of the most important things that we can do as scholars or academics, but then also others who care about these ideas is just to keep them alive, just to be a voice, to be a platform, to say, here are these types of ideas, and here's our scholars that have really advanced the field, and we just, if nothing else, keep that space, even if it sounds like we're repeating what they said, like that's fine, that's okay. We don't have to worry if that's all we're doing is repeating what the greats before us had to say. That's fine with me. If that's all my, in my career, that's all I end up doing.
Well, my fear is that because of political correctness, some of us cannot be as aggressive as the greats, like David Landis.
That might be true. But I guess perhaps we have to just choose our words more carefully, but we can still put the content of the ideas out there.
Yes, no, we can get, no, we're going to get back to the conversation to talk about the second virtue, individual self-determination. How important is autonomy? And I have a lot to say on this topic,
Mhm.
Claudia, but go ahead.
Yeah. So, in part of the understanding the importance of individualism, there's different aspects to it. And I think that that's probably one in terms of self autonomy that maybe is underappreciated and maybe not as discussed as much as what I think is its value holds in motivating individuals to act. And so, yes, individuals have different preferences, they value cost and benefits differently, but at the same time we have to understand that whatever it is that their goals are, what motivates them to act. And one of the things is that they actually believe if they are trying to achieve their goal, the actions that they take matter. And so it's not luck or randomness or, political favors that's going to get them what they want. It's through, their understanding their alternative ways of achieving those goals. And that if they are pursuing them, that they bear the cost and benefits and the consequences, positive or negative, from their actions. So I do think self-autonomy very much correlates with, individualism, innovation, entrepreneurship.
And Claudia, now I'm going to tell you about my anecdotal examples. During my conversation with Peter Becky, we listed some empirical examples arguing for the salience of individual autonomy. But when you disseminate real life examples, it's often more appealing. Claudia, in Jamaica, there is a community called Sufferers Heights. It means you're suffering, you're poor. Poverty is not a badge of honor, Claudia. If you call your community Sufferers Heights, you're going to remain poor.
True.
Yeah, so and there's also the habit of some, you meet them and you say, hello, how are you doing? Well, I'm hanging on, I'm struggling as usual. These are negative traits.
Yeah, so that's a good
Anecdotal example, and I have
yeah,
too many, too many.
Yeah, well, that's not good. But yes, this idea that it's just this is the lot that you've been given in life, and there's just nothing you can do about it. That is not true. But we can understand why individuals may end up feeling that way if they live in countries where politicians and bureaucrats are corrupt, and if they do acquire any amount of wealth, then it can be expropriated for them for any reason. That then you aren't going to believe that you can change, and grow and get out of poverty.
And in these countries, affluence is often viewed with suspicion because most people are not rich.
Well, yes, and there would be a lot of assumption that you are corrupt or you are working with others who then are corrupt. And so I think that is that suspicion is probably warranted in those countries, but it is unfortunate that that's the state that state of the country that they're currently residing in.
And what's unfortunate, Claudia, is that with increasing levels of development and exposure, the culture remains the same because it has been inculcated for such a long time that even if you become more educated, these cultural residues remain.
That's true. So education maybe matters for the individual, but it may not change cultural norms across groups. But what could, and what I would like to see, I guess, more research and the understanding of it, is that the market participation. So if you would liberalize your markets, that could then have major changes in those negative cultural norms and biases.
Yes, Mexico is an example. Boris Gershman, in one of his papers, he mentioned Mexico. So there was a period of liberalization in Mexico and people became less envious.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example.
Yeah, I actually have an article on envy and development, and I do believe that I cited the example of Mexico. But again, Claudia, it is quite difficult for capitalism to flow to developing countries. Do you remember that paper, Why Doesn't Capitalism Flow to Developing Countries?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, it's the
Mm.
low trust, corruption, and people who are often successful tend to be linked to the political system. So ordinary people don't have an incentive to trust the system. But then again, the system
Yeah.
is not the free market. So if a serious politician who was committed to development would promote the actual market, then trust will increase.
And part of the problem there is they have no incentive. The ones that can change it have no incentive to do so because they're already benefiting from the current system.
Unless, well, some people don't like it when I refer to Singapore, but unless they elect a leader with the foresight and insight of Lee Kuan Yew.
Yeah, so it is possible. It is absolutely possible to get that type of change. And we've seen it happen, as you mentioned, Singapore. But we have too many other examples where it doesn't happen because for one reason or another, either it's not a democracy, or if it is, then they are electing their leaders for other reasons besides their views on liberalizing markets.
Yeah, I said yes because the thought of China just emerged in my head. Some people like to credit industrial policy for China's success, but Nina Wang and that late Nobel Prize winning economist, they disagree. And there are many studies disagreeing that China is successful as a result of industrial policy. And today we see where on the right American industrial policy is becoming successful, but the evidence is telling us something else. On average, industrial policy is a failure and the successes are really exaggerated. So for example, government and the internet. Government is inept at commercializing research. So even if government funds the research, it is commercialized by the private sector. So I wouldn't recommend industrial policy for America.
I agree with that completely. It is not, you can't pick the winners because you can't know beforehand. It's the Kersnerian entrepreneurial discovery process. We don't know the winners. It has to be discovered in markets. So government is incapable of knowing beforehand and then having the proper political incentives, even if they would somehow know the winners, to actually pick and support the winners.
It's just like even with this YouTube channel. So I started the channel in March and I interview people, and I do respect my guests. They're smart people, but some onlookers would say, wow, how do you get these people? How do you get Robin Dunbar and Richard Nisbet and you and all these people? You can't predict the winner.
That's right, exactly. And people across a variety of the spectrum have great ideas to talk about, and we should have more and more conversations about these types of ideas.
Yeah, and to be honest, Claudia, I'm getting all the people on the spectrum, on the left, the right, far left, far right, they're all saying yes.
That's fantastic. That is amazing. That's great. That you are creating a marketplace for ideas.
Yes, but how many people would predict that a random person from Jamaica would be doing this?
You're right. You would not think that, but here you are.
That's why it's so funny. Like, yeah, it's really hilarious. No one is expecting some random guy from Jamaica who's not rich to be interviewing Eric Kaufman. It's a statistical improbability. Sometimes I really just laugh.
I understand that. I understand that completely.
Yeah. Now we're going to talk about respect, the third virtue. How important is respect?
Respect goes hand in hand with kind of the underlying value system of trust/individualism, in the sense that you can have respect for those, again, in your small network, or do you have what we would call generalized respect? So we relate this to an argument that Banfield in his work in 1958 called limited versus generalized morality. And so the way that we think that respect/morality can work is that do you kind of rationalize, or do you believe that it's okay to treat two different groups differently, for example? So it's okay to cheat an outsider, but you would never cheat whoever's inside your own network. So that's what we would call, or Banfield calls, limited morality. And if that's the case, then we're back in the situation like a low trust society, where you maybe will interact and trust people in your family or your small network or tribe, but you don't trust or respect those outside of the network. And so that, if that's the case, then again, you're going to get stuck. You're not going to expand your market activity, expand and see wide scale economic growth. But with generalized morality or a generalized level of respect for individuals, then we would see participation across groups, ethnic groups, tribes, countries. You don't hold these biases or think I can cheat. I don't think it's okay to cheat anybody. So that's more what we consider generalized morality, and how generalized respect would promote economic exchange and positive economic production.
Edward Banfield is another genius. He got it right.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Basis of backward societies.
That's right.
There's actually a new paper published by Enber, and it's looking at medieval cities in Italy and the free market. And the conclusion is that there's a relationship between development, free market cities, and trust in the medieval ages.
Yes, I think from the historical perspective, it's fascinating to read how values and virtue and this idea of respect and trust has really, I would argue, and they are arguing, underpinned the successful medieval cities. So I think that type of work is just fascinating to read.
And no, I will provide an anecdotal example. It's like customer service, or calling a bank or any business place. You call and you say, well, usually whenever I get a call, it could be a business call or a social call, I'm naturally polite. But usually you call a business place or a person and you say hello, and the individual is rude. But then you say, I know your boss, and he becomes this pleasant, virtuous angel.
Yeah, that's interesting. That would be a good example. It's unfortunate that's what it takes to have a pleasant interaction. But I guess you're now on the inside a little bit.
Yes, and they say, oh, I didn't know that you were related to this person, and it happens too frequently.
Yes, that is not what we mean by, that's more of the limited morality, not generalized morality.
Claudia, I'm going to ask a question that's difficult and we're yet to find the answer. How do we really promote trust? How is trust obtained? How does a society make the transition from being low trust to high trust? We still don't have an answer.
No, we don't. And some of it is the micro versus the macro perspective. So on a micro level, individuals figure out ways to signal their trustworthiness. So, and this happens, in our day-to-day lives. When you enter a relationship with somebody, a friendship or otherwise, it's you want them to believe that they can confide in you and that you could confide in them. And so there are ways that we do signal whether or not we're trustworthy. I think that happens also with business transactions, and that you are not going to cheat, you're not going to renege on your contract. And so that's more at the micro level, and the ability to scale that up or use it, with anonymous agents. That's the bigger question, is how do I believe that someone that I've never met in another country is not going to cheat me? That's much harder to facilitate. But we do see businesses trying to figure out, and they're trying to, be creative to do that, to signal trustworthiness. And so I do think that it's going to be more of a market response answer. If it's going to take entrepreneurs who figure out ways to signal or figure out a platform or other alternatives that can facilitate transactions, either in the absence of trust, or it can actually facilitate trust itself.
We do know that markets promote trust, but but then again, how do we get people to form markets in the first place and then transcend limited trust to develop generalized trust? This is still a complicated issue, but markets do promote trust, tolerance, and diversity.
Absolutely.
And in relation to the shock doctrine, this is a little off topic, but Cato has a new paper reviewing the data, and the evidence is that the shock doctrine is actually positive. So the quicker the liberalization, the more developed the country will become, and it's also correlated with well-being. So Naomi Klein is wrong. The shock doctrine is good.
Yes, I'm familiar with this debate between the gradualism and shock therapy argument, especially during the transition from the Eastern European countries transitioning away from communism and the appropriate way to do that. And I think that it would not be surprising to me that the results support a shock therapy, because if you are liberalizing and you're liberalizing all markets at once, it's going to maybe be a huge shock, maybe even a huge negative shock, but the ability for entrepreneurs to start figuring out how to trade internationally or how to get prices right will happen quicker than under a gradualist transition period. So I think that does make intuitive sense. But I think what we've seen empirically is what happens is that countries will start to liberalize one part and not another, and you can't necessarily do that. And if that's what we mean by gradualism, then you're not going to see much of the benefit from any of the liberalization.
Exactly, Claudia. I'm agreeing with you, but at the same time, your research is extremely important. If countries do not have the right mix of institutions and culture, then the shock doctrine can pose a problem.
So if the cultural norms, as you've been discussing and we've been discussing in other countries, are not where norms that would normally support a market-based system, and you introduce markets through kind of shock therapy, I think that, again, you can have, maybe then we wouldn't see as much economic growth as we would anticipate, but over time, so let's say that we don't backslide and then deliberalize markets. If you leave the markets open, then I think then you'll see cultural values and trust, for example, start to increase. And over time, you're going to see the values shift that would align more closely with what we would consider values that do support a market-based system.
I do agree, but the Cambridge Journal of Institutional Economics has been publishing some really fascinating research papers on the link between individualism and the free market.
Yes, so there's work that shows that individualistic cultural values tend to support or underlie economic freedom, or what we would say a market economy. And that makes sense. That's why I said earlier, we can kind of call individualistic cultural values capitalistic values, because they end up supporting a capitalist system. People that hold individualistic values also value private property. They value contract enforcement and rule of law. They value, holding people to their word. They would value, again, innovation, creativity, lack of conformity, individual responsibility. And those are the values that we see align with a market-based economy.
Exactly. Now, Claudia, we're going to speak briefly about your paper, Economic Freedom, Culture, and Growth. Comment on it briefly because we're wrapping up.
This was a paper, and this is still some of the ideas that I think we're grappling with, but in this paper, it was just an initial look at trying to understand how both economic freedom and cultural values can relate to growth. So economic freedom being a way that we can measure how capitalistic your society is. And then looking at, these values related to trust and respect and, lack of obedience, and then this locus of control argument. And so in some sense, is economic freedom the kind of the formal rules versus these cultural values? Are they complements? Are they substitutes to each other? How do they work together? And in that particular paper, it really just depended on the specification, but we did find that oftentimes economic freedom kind of trumped the cultural values. But then in a follow-up paper, what we found was that they have a positive interaction effect. So basically, the biggest bang for your buck that you can get is to have capitalistic cultural values combined with economic freedom. And those are the countries that tend to grow the fastest.
What is the name of the second paper, Claudia?
That's a good question. I just forgot. It will come to me in 30 seconds. I will tell you. Capitalism, I believe, is in the name of the paper. But yeah, so we had me and she was a PhD student at the time. We started trying to understand the association or the links between culture and the formal institutions of economic freedom. And so that's what we ended up exploring, not only like their independent effects, but their interaction effects. So the second paper is called The Cultural Context, the Productivity of Capitalism. And that was published in 2011 by Kyklos.
By who? By
Kyklos, Kyklos.
Okay, the name of the publishing company. Well, Claudia,
yes.
I love your research and I plan to do more research to identify some of your newer papers, but you're on the ball.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that you've even read any of my papers.
Well, most sensible people are busy reading your papers. Yes, you laugh, but it's the truth. If I don't read your paper, I can't have the show because it would be pretentious for me to interview you without reading the paper. Well,
that is true. So you're busy as well.
Yes, but it was a pleasure to speak to you, Claudia, and be honest. I'm sure that you have done several interviews. Is this one the best?
Absolutely. You are a pleasure to talk to.
And I read your work, unlike some of the other people.
True. So it was a very engaging and enlightening conversation to have.
Yes, so it was a pleasure to speak to you, Claudia, and we're going to communicate again, but bye.
Bye. Take care.
All right.